I appreciate your having this hearing, Mr. Chairman. An interesting conversation about the history. The way I sort of see this is that, the turn of the 20th century, the biggest banks, and J.P. Morgan was one of the prime examples, played an active role in the management of many of the nation's key industrial companies. J.P. Morgan partners, for example, sat routinely on the boards of railroad companies, steel companies, other large corporations. Now, it began to change leading up to the Great Depression as reformers like Louis Brandeis warned again and again and again about the dangers of both conflicts of interests and the concentration of power. And as they generated greater and greater public support for the notion that these should be separated, after the 1929 crash, the Glass-Steagall Act clamped down on the bank's interconnectedness with industry by separating boring banking, like checking and savings accounts, from the high-risk gambling found on Wall Street. So I'm glad we're having this hearing today because our banks and industrials have changed, but the dangers of concentration and the principles at stake have not. And that's why I share the concern of many of my colleagues about asset managers at huge Wall Street banks exercising control over key parts of America's infrastructure. So I thought I'd start my questions with you, Mr. Rosner. If we ever experience, again, a crisis like the crisis in 2008, how do you think Wall Street control over electric plants or seaports or airports could factor into the systemic risk confronted by the Department of Treasury and the Fed and ultimately the taxpayer?
Right. As I said in my testimony, I think that those are very real risks that need to be considered. The situation is not terribly different than in 2008, where we watched the industry go from originally making mortgage loans to taking over through investment banking the entire mortgage complex, from front, hiring third-party mortgage originators, pooling, packaging securities, making money on the sale and trading of those securities, proprietary trading on those securities, owning the servicing, and in some cases we watched the servicing companies that they purchased run not by separate divisions, but actually be owned and operated by the trading desk, creating significant opportunities for informational advantage of the firm over its customers, and incentives that frankly led to many of the outcomes that we've seen, and losses. Okay, the problem ends up being that with the backstop of the Federal Reserve, with the backstop of insured deposit regimes through the FDIC, there will always be an ultimate call on the system. Now, one institution theoretically could be resolved under Dodd-Frank. I don't believe that Title I, Title II works, but even assuming that it could, the reality is if we had a catastrophic risk in one of these infrastructure businesses, the counterparty exposure would lead to exactly the same outcome. The calls for more collateral, the risk of contagion, counterparties backing away, liquidity leaving the system, and ultimately the government being called in to stabilize the risk against the risk of contagion.
Or to say this another way, the interconnectedness
Absolutely
increases the likelihood that these institutions remain too big to fail.
That's right. And as I said before, one does have to question what would have happened if, in fact, the Exxon Valdez was owned by one of these bank holding companies.
Yeah. Good. Thank you. I have another question for you. I don't think there's any question that institutional investors like pension funds hope that asset managers at a big bank will return solid profits over time. But I also don't think that most retirees realize that their pension or retirement savings are used to pave the way for big banks to be able to control an electric plant or an oil refinery. So, Mr. Rosner, what dangers do you think result from big banks spending, as Brandeis put it, other people's money to amass this kind of power and control.
Well, I mean, I think we saw this with J.P. Morgan's ownership and control of U.S. Steel, 1/6 of the nation's rail lines, General Electric and Edison. And we saw some of the outcomes, the consolidation of the power, the impact on pricing. I think it's also, though, important to really think about, and if you have any questions about the strategy here, look at some of the footnotes in my written testimony. The statements, the language used by these asset managers, these bank-run asset managers, in pitching to those firms include the advantages of controlling monopolistic and quasi-monopolistic assets as an inflation hedge because of the ability to negotiate long-term leases with riders that allow pricing to rise even when demand falls.
So say this one again, Mr. Rosner. I mean, I just want to make sure you put the right summary on this. These people are out amassing this power. They're using the money that people invest, for example, in their pension plans. They're using it to amass this power, and then they're selling, in effect, themselves on the notion that if you will invest with their company, they are going to have the benefits of having created this powerful and interconnected sort of a corporate and banking conglomerate that will be able not only to produce big returns because you figured out the right things to invest in, but produce big returns because they will have, as you describe it, monopoly control.
As they describe.
As you describe, they're describing.
Correct.
Because they will have monopoly.
That's correct.
Thank you, Mr. Rosner. I think that's clear. Mr. Chairman, thank you.